Hello, I'm Ed Fuquay, young adult librarian extraordinaire here at Woonsocket Harris Public Library.
And I'm Michaela, human being here at Woonsocket Harris Public Library.
We're here for another edition of Booktalking.
Yes.
And today we get to talk about one of our favorite writers and one of our favorite characters, Sherlock Holmes, and his creator, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle.
Yes, I'm so excited about this one. It was so nice to go back and, reread some Sherlock. Obviously not all of them. There's so many Sherlock short stories, and I know 4 full novels as well.
Yeah.
But yes, oh my gosh, Arthur Conan Doyle, he created one of the most beloved characters of all time.
And one of the most recognizable characters in the world.
Yeah.
You can go to virtually any country on earth and show someone a picture of a guy with like a pipe and a deerstalker cap, and they'll immediately say, oh, Sherlock Holmes, in whatever language they're in. One of the most famous fictional characters ever created. There's been more like movies about him than any other character except possibly Dracula.
Oh yeah, absolutely. During my research for this, going across all the different information, I found out that apparently no other character, basically the character of Sherlock has been portrayed by more actors. It's record breaking. No one through all the skits, the TV shows, the adaptations for film, the short little commercials. You'll sometimes see Sherlock. He's just such a recognizable character. More actors have played Sherlock Holmes than any other character.
Yeah.
Which is just phenomenal. Oh my goodness. But we're here to talk about books.
Yes, the books.
The books and Arthur Conan Doyle himself.
Yeah, he was kind of an amazing guy.
Yeah.
He did a lot of cool things in his life. He was a medical doctor.
Yes.
In a lot of ways, Sherlock Holmes wasn't modeled after himself, but in a lot of ways, Watson was modeled after Doyle.
Yeah.
Doyle was a big, bluff sportsman. He boxed, he played cricket. He had a keen sense of justice. Mm-hmm. He had the good luck to, when he was in college, to have Dr. Joseph Bell as his professor.
Oh, that's excellent.
Yeah, Bell was a genius at making acute observations. He could diagnose the patient just by looking at them, everybody said.
That's incredible.
Yeah, Bell was kind of amazing. And Bell was definitely the model for Sherlock Holmes. So much so, in fact, that Robert Louis Stevenson, who'd gone to the same university, actually wrote Doyle and said, "Is that Professor Bell I hear?"
That's wonderful. Oh my goodness.
And in fact, the character of House from the TV series is also modeled after that.
I did not know that.
Yes, that's very much a Sherlock Holmes / Joseph Bell take.
I can kind of see it. I can definitely see the comparison there.
Yeah, he's drug addicted, has Holmes's obsessive rudeness, and can diagnose a patient just by looking at them. So
fabulously quotable.
Yes, absolutely. Doyle was a doctor, but he wanted to be a writer. He was never that successful as a doctor.
Yeah, no, during my research, I knew that he was a medical doctor. I knew that was his full-time profession. He was writing these kind of like just something as a hobby.
Yeah, between patients.
Between patients, he would just, and with all the variations of different cases that Holmes kind of takes on, some of that inspiration must have come from some of the patients he runs into.
He didn't have an upper-class clientele, so he saw a wide swath of people in his profession.
Also, everybody lies to their doctor.
Yeah, yeah.
Sherlock. One of the main things about Sherlock is, everybody lies. Yeah. Everyone lies. Yeah. That's just kind of. Oh my goodness. But Sherlock Holmes, absolutely. Do you want to go into Sherlock as a man? I know we have a lot more to talk about Arthur Conan Doyle.
A little more about Doyle, first of all. As a medical doctor, he was very keen on getting people vaccinated. Mm-hmm. Vaccines are even more controversial in those days than they are now, if you can believe that. Because the whole concept of being vaccinated against a disease was something that was just inconceivable to most people. Mm-hmm. He hated anti-vaxxers. He wrote editorials against them and attacked them in the press all the time. He would not tolerate that. He had a keen sense of justice. Mm-hmm. He worked on, he cleared a man of charges of animal mutilation. And he also got a man released from prison who'd been convicted of murder.
That's amazing.
Yeah. In real life, of course, he was never able to actually solve either crime, but he proved that people who were arrested were in fact innocent, and the charges were dropped against them. In one case, the charges were later completely commuted. His success at attacking corrupt criminal convictions eventually led to the creation of the first Court of Appeals in England.
That's amazing.
So he's responsible for redeeming the lives of who knows how many hundreds or thousands of people.
Arthur Conan Doyle.
Yeah, he was an amazing guy.
I know that, of course, he wrote a ton of short stories about Sherlock. In total, there are 56 Sherlock short stories and 4 novels, although he wanted to end with story number 25, the Reichenbach Fall, where he effectively...
Adventure of the Final Bow.
That was meant to be, the end. He killed off both Sherlock and Sherlock's arch nemesis, Moriarty, who I believe we talked about in our villain segment as one of the most notorious villains of all time. And the fan outcry was just so...
People in London wore black armbands after Sherlock Holmes died.
Yeah, apparently he just received thousands. They can't even count all the letters that he received. There were too many letters, and they all, of course, got lost. And for basically for postage failings, they cannot fully know how many letters were sent to Arthur Conan Doyle. But after book number 25, he went on to complete 56. I can't get over that number.
Yeah, he wound up coming back and doing more. He's by far the most popular author of his day. Doing the research for this, one of the things I noticed was that he was tired of writing Sherlock Holmes, and he felt some of his other work was equally worthy of study, but everybody ignored that in favor of Sherlock Holmes. Plus, in the real world, his wife is suffering from tuberculosis. Yeah. She was in declining health. And after he, quote, killed Sherlock Holmes, he went with his wife on a tour of Europe. And spent the rest of her time in this world with her. And it wasn't until she had passed away, he'd gone back to England and remarried, they actually sat down and started writing Sherlock Holmes stories again. So, a bit of like personal tragedy in his life, but when he first started, studying Scarlet was not that popular. It came and went, and people obviously noticed it, or he wouldn't still be here.
It's phenomenal.
That's the one where Sherlock Holmes hears a story about Mormon ninja. Yeah, it's the one that Doyle later had to apologize to the Mormon church for making them out as kidnappers and child molesters and murderers. Doyle would get better. After Studying Scarlet came out, he wrote Micah Klug, a historical novel that almost no one has read. And then that was kind of the end of his writing career for a while.
He kind of just... I'm not successful, I'm going to take a break.
Yeah, until that fateful year in 1889, when the editor of Lippincott magazine in America contacted him. They were starting a British branch of Lippincott, and they wanted to hit the ground running with popular writers. Even though Doyle wasn't a popular writer, someone at Lippincott's had read Studying Scarlet and thought there was more to the Sherlock Holmes character. So they had a dinner at the Langham Hotel in England between Conan Doyle and Oscar Wilde. And according to his memoirs of that night, Wilde and Doyle hit it off. They appear on the surface to have absolutely nothing in common. But Doyle was in awe of how popular Wilde was and what a fantastic writer he was. And the two of them got along famously, and they both agreed to work for Lippincott. And so Doyle went back and wrote Sign of the Four, the second Sherlock Holmes story, involving a mystery reaching back to the Indian Mutiny. And Wilde would later go on to write Picture of Dorian Gray for Lippincott.
That's amazing.
Two amazing literary works from that one dinner.
To be a fly on the wall at that dinner.
I know.
That's amazing. So it just... his, Studying Scarlet just fell into the right hands. And if it hadn't, the world would be a much different, sadder place without Sherlock.
And after that, the Strand magazine noticed the second one, and they picked him up, and they're willing to buy any Sherlock Holmes story he would write. And they paired him with Sidney Paget, their artist in residence, who would produce the definitive pictures of Sherlock Holmes. This is a collection of all the Strand Sherlock Holmes, including the original illustrations.
That's awesome.
Yeah, it's an amazing book. And after that, he never looked back.
Yeah.
There was tons of Sherlock Holmes stories. He was always putting out more. Anything else about Doyle?
I don't have much about Doyle. I know he had a fabulous, just amazing life, and but still, it's just most of my research. I had to cut myself off, basically, on doing Sherlock Holmes research. Of course, I've read a lot of the short stories, and have loved some of the adaptations of them. But Sherlock as a character, he's just so compelling. He's so amazing, and
he's amazing. The first story, Studying Scarlet, isn't so much a mystery about solving a murder. It's about one roommate trying to figure out his quirky, eccentric roommate. Since Watson and Holmes don't know each other, and they move in together, and Holmes never says what he does for a living.
Yeah.
And Watson actually writes a series of clues trying to deduce what it is that Holmes does for money.
I actually have a list.
Yes.
An evaluation of Sherlock's skills from A Study in Scarlet.
That's hysterical.
Knowledge of literature, nil. Knowledge of astronomy, nil. Knowledge of politics, feeble. Knowledge of botany, variable. Well up in belladonna, opium, and poisons, generally knows nothing of practical gardening. Knowledge of geography, practical but limited. Tells at a glance different soils from each other after walks. Has shown me splashes upon his trousers and told me by their color and consistence in what part of London he had received them. Knowledge of chemistry, profound. Knowledge of anatomy, accurate but unsystematic. Knowledge of sensationalism, immense. He appears to know every detail of every horror perpetuated in century. Plays the violin well, is an expert single-stick player, boxer, and swordsman, and has a good practical knowledge of British law.
Yeah, that sums it up.
And that's just in novel one, where
That's
he barely knows him.
Yeah. Watson picks all this up, trying to figure out what the heck is going on with this weird guy. But they would, of course, go on to become great, famous friends. But yeah, he's such a quirky character. It's all seen through the eyes of Watson. So we never really know what's going on in Holmes's head. It's almost a shock when one of the later books actually writes it from Holmes's point of view. Yeah, which is really a surprise because we really only see Holmes as like Watson sees him.
Well, it's interesting because, when you have such a brilliant character, even though Watson himself is very impressive, incredibly impressive, you need to see him through the lens of the everyman to kind of enjoy the comedy that comes along with living with such an exceptional but insane person. Absolutely. There's a great quote that I found, and it's in one of the novels. It's because a lot of the fans of Sherlock Holmes would compare him to other famous detectives of the day. Of course, Sherlock is being told, "You remind me of Edgar Allan Poe's Dupin. I had no idea that such individuals did exist outside of stories." Sherlock Holmes rose and lit his pipe. "No doubt you think that you are complimenting me and comparing me to Dupin," he observed. "Now, in my opinion, Dupin was a very inferior fellow. That trick of his breaking in on friends' thoughts and with an apropos remark after a quarter of an hour's silence is really very showy and superficial. He had some analytical genius, no doubt, but he was by no means such a phenomenon as Poe appeared to imagine." And then, of course, Watson says, "Have you read Gobbereau's works? Does Lecoq come up to your idea of a detective?" Sherlock Holmes sniffed sardonically. "Lecoq was a miserable bungler," he said in an angry voice. "He had only one thing to recommend him, and that was his energy. That book made me positively ill. The question was how to identify an unknown prisoner. I could have done it in 24 hours. Lecoq took 6 months or so. It might be made a textbook for detectives to teach them what to avoid." Fabulous. It's just fabulous. It's just... Yeah,
having Holmes, a fictional detective, make fun of other fictional detectives. It gives it that weird kind of like meta-reality. So many people believe that Sherlock Holmes is a living person. To this day, hundreds of letters arrive at 221B Baker Street written to Sherlock Holmes.
Well, it's a museum.
It's now a museum, above a pub. Yes, I've been there. It's really nice.
Is it amazing?
Yes. They've totally recreated Sherlock Holmes' drawing room and everything there. One of the tricks that Doyle does to add a verisimilitude to it is have Holmes and Watson discuss cases that Doyle never wrote. They mention things that we've never seen. My favorite being the adventure of the giant rat of Sumatra, for which the world is not yet prepared to know. And we never will know because Doyle never wrote that story. And I seriously doubt if he had any idea. He was just tossing together words that sounded good. But the fact that Watson and Holmes seem to have a life after the story comes to an end, as if they are real people. They mentioned all kinds of things that were commonplace to them, but of course not to us. And that makes them seem so realistic. Doyle also had a knack for bringing people to life with really brief descriptions. As a writer myself, I really admire that. He takes time building up Sherlock's character, but like Moriarty is only mentioned in one story and literally appears on stage in another story. And yet he's still considered one of the greatest villains in all of literature. Because he's drawn that dramatically. Irene Adler in A Scandal in Bohemia.
Yes.
She has less than a dozen lines in the story, really. She's mostly a character people talk about and react to. But she is the woman, and she outwits Sherlock Holmes completely in that story and walks away with everything she wants and leaves Holmes just sort of standing there holding the bag. It's really hysterical. And again, she seems like a fully conceived and realized character, but that was all Doyle had to say about her.
Yeah.
She comes on screen, she does her stuff, and then she disappears again. And that kind of vividness in the characterization was like a real genius for a writer.
Oh, absolutely. It's just, even the main characters, there is definitely a lot of internal thought that's happening that you, the reader, don't really get to see, but you have to infer. Let me take a look. I'm sorry. I have so many notes on Sherlock Holmes.
Yeah.
Yes. Oh, can we talk about elementary, my dear Watson? Because it never happened.
No, Holmes never said that. He said elementary a few times, and he said my dear Watson a few times, but never together.
In the complete Sherlock Holmes, there is one line. It's excellent, I cried. Elementary, said he. That's the closest I could find. Yeah. That's it. He does say elementary, but never, ever elementary, my dear Watson.
We'll discuss next time how the different interpretations of Holmes that don't come from the original canon. It's Holmes is the symbol of the detective. He is the detective.
He is the detective.
He also personifies the concept of logic. My favorite quote about that, logic is the supreme tool by which we study the world. From a drop of water, one should be able to deduce both the Atlantic and Niagara. To which Watson exclaims, "What an effable twaddle."
Watson's responses are sometimes even better than the really profound things that Sherlock says.
Yeah, we should all slip "what an effable twaddle" into our conversation.
Yes, absolutely. What an effable twaddle.
It's Holmes had a way of looking at the world that makes him so powerful and compelling. Another quote that I think about a lot. It is a capital mistake, my dear Watson, to theorize before one has gathered the facts, because then one will inevitably twist facts to support theory rather than twisting theory to support facts. Yes, every real-life police officer should have that hanging on their wall, because it's always human nature to guess what's going on when you arrive on a crime scene. And you're frequently completely wrong, but if you have an idea in your head, you'll only look for the clues that lead to that idea. All of these false convictions that Doyle in real life overturned all led from exactly that. Yeah.
Another great one is, when you've eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth.
Yeah.
And it's just coming from that same, and it's funny because I have those quotes back to back. But yeah, no, it you can definitely tell the inner workings of Arthur Conan Doyle from reading these very justice oriented things that Sherlock does go ahead and say.
Sherlock, like Doyle, was a champion of the underdog. He frequently worked for no money or very little money. He's mostly interested in things that challenge his intellect. If a poor person comes to him with a fascinating riddle, he will immediately drop whatever he's doing to work on it. He'll stop working for the Queen to solve a newsboy's problem if that problem is really interesting.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Another great quote. Watson, come at once if convenient. If inconvenient, come all the same. That's kind of how it feels,
In recent interpretations of Sherlock, they've always, not always, but it's become quite common to consider him autistic, that he has a hard time with human relationships and human emotions. But going back and reading the original stories again after hearing some of these theories, it's not so much that he doesn't understand human emotion, he just doesn't care.
Yeah, no, it's...
Being rude doesn't bother him.
In the grand scheme, it does not matter.
Yeah, but it ultimately doesn't.
He's a character completely, able to form, long-lasting friendships and attachments, and he's very compassionate. I wouldn't say at all that he has any sort of, anything like that. Granted, it's hard to know. He's a fictional character. But
there's one of the stories, Watson is injured, and Holmes catches up with the guy that did it. And he makes some comment, I believe, is a fortunate thing for you, he will recover. You would not leave this room alive.
Yeah.
Yeah.
My goodness. I have a list of. Now, Sherlock Holmes, of course, has a flair for the dramatic, which is another reason why I absolutely love this character. But I do have a list. He's quite a good actor as well, because I have a list of the different disguises that he uses across the different short stories and novels. In A Sign of Four, he disguises himself as a seaman. He disguises himself as an unemployed groom and a nonconformist clergyman in A Scandal in Bohemia.
Yes.
The Man with a Twisted Lip, he disguises himself as an opium addict, which is not that far from the truth.
Yeah, he had a coke habit.
Yeah, a coke and opium. It depends on the day.
Yeah.
It depended on the day.
Depends on the day,
And you always ask Watson, are we having a coke day or an opium day? To which Watson would usually respond with, oh yes, no, cocaine today. He was a common loafer in The Adventure of the Barrel Cornet, an old Italian priest in The Adventure of the Final Problem, a bookseller in The Adventure of the Empty House, a plumber in The Adventure of Charles Augustus Milverton, a dying man in The Adventure of a Dying Detective, an old sporting man in The Adventure of Mazarin Stone, and my favorite, an old woman in The Adventure of Mazarin Stone.
Yeah, almost every fictional hero who sought that kind of status would become a master of disguise after that.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. He's just so phenomenal.
Yeah. And of course, Irene Adler sees right through his disguise.
Oh, immediately.
Yeah, immediately. One thing I noticed reading the books again is in the stories, Holmes is more fallible.
Yeah.
He's a thinking machine, but at the same time, he can be fooled. He makes mistakes. In one of the stories, and I forget which one it is, he's trying to follow someone who gets into a cab. And Holmes jumps onto the back of the cab to hold on to it. The person simply gets out the other side of the cab and keeps going, and has paid the cab driver some money to drive around in a circle.
Yep.
Yeah, and when he gets back and tells Watson the story, he's laughing so hard he can barely speak at how easily he was fooled by a schoolboy's trick.
Well, he does. He is human. He gets caught up, and he's like, "No, this idea is so splendid. I am on their tail." He gets caught up in things.
Yeah.
To have him be perfect would make him far less compelling and interesting.
Yeah.
The fact that at any moment, he could be wrong. There is always that potential. It's rare, but there is that potential. It's what keeps everything so interesting within the novel. It's what's keeping you wanting to know what will happen next. The fact that there is, although a small percentage chance of failure, there is a chance of failure.
Although he is in really good condition. He's like a master of Buritsu, a Victorian martial art.
Yes.
He also doesn't care much for his own personal safety, so he thinks nothing of throwing himself at great personal risk, and occasionally himself and Watson in great personal risk.
Well, especially when he's on a case. Something he says, quite a few times across the different short stories is, the game is afoot. This is a game to him, and he needs to win.
He's so excited when a murder occurs. He constantly complains that the criminals in London just present no challenge to him.
He's the only person who gets excited. He's like, oh, yeah, big juicy murder.
Yes.
Big juicy murder. Somebody's been kidnapped. Excellent. No, but just an absolutely fascinating character. I did have a quote on his drug use. He injects cocaine, a 7% solution, using a personal syringe that he keeps in a Morocco leather case.
Of course, yes.
It's the finest. I know that his drug use is pretty prevalent. It's something that in the novels he only really... Watson calls it his only vice, even though he's constantly smoking on a pipe. Yeah.
It wasn't considered a vice in those days.
No, not at all, especially if you're a gentleman, which, even though he's taking these jobs, he still kind of is considered one. He has enough repute. He's kind of like, he's famous enough to be a gentleman, even though he's working. But it's something he says he uses to keep his mind stimulated when there are no cases, because he needs to constantly keep his mind up. He has to have that constant stimulation, And he's terrified of, becoming mentally inadequate, especially with the character, which we haven't touched on, his brother. Mycroft Holmes.
Even more of a genius than he is.
Yes. Even more of a genius. Sherlock, he kind of struggles with, he definitely has that, there's that sibling rivalry there when it comes to being intelligent. Mycroft, of course, is in the employ of Her Majesty the Queen, and what works for Her Majesty. Yeah,
the famous quote is, sometimes Mycroft is the British government.
Yes.
Yeah, and there's also that famous scene where they're standing at a window making comments about people as they walk past and correcting each other. No, I would say that indicates she was in Afghanistan, not India. Oh, I see. Yeah, so
Reducing
people are
a
seeing for
person's
2
whole
seconds.
life.
They very much have a rivalry, but at the same time also care for each other. They must have an odd family, which neither Holmes ever talks about.
Yeah, no, there's very little known about the early life of Sherlock.
Yeah, the family was wealthy enough to own land, so he probably comes from a gentry family, but obviously not wealthy because he's not rich.
No, he's not rich. He rents. He doesn't even own his home. In fact, he's, the whole reason that Dr. Watson comes in is because he's broke and he needs a roommate to help cover the rent. Yeah, you have
to split the rent to afford that apartment on 221B. Yeah.
But they must have been wealthy enough that, they do state, it's very vague, that he went to one of the country's top colleges, which they assume is either Cambridge or Oxford, or even perhaps both. I know there's a lot of speculation as to his education. But outside of exactly what is happening in the moment, there is not much known about this incredible genius.
Yeah, it's pretty much a mystery. And when I was in England, one of the places I visited was St. Bartholomew's Hospital. And at St. Bart's, as Watson calls it, there's actually a brass plaque on the wall that says, "I perceive you have been in Afghanistan. On this spot, in 18 such and such, Sherlock Holmes met Dr. John H. Watson for the first time."
Amazing.
Yep. He was so popular. These people stood in line to get the Strand magazine when it had a new Sherlock Holmes story.
That's amazing.
It was huge. And I know why I like Sherlock Holmes so much. When you're a little kid who knows he's smarter than the average bear and that your brain is the only thing you have to protect you from a very hostile world, when you run across a character who embodies the idea of brains over brawn, Sherlock Holmes is your hero.
Absolutely.
Why millions of people love him as much as I do, I'm not really certain.
Well, there's so many things. Yes, it's the fact that he is so brilliant, but he's also flawed. You can identify, even if you don't have the same issues as Sherlock, or you don't, there's definitely something there to identify with. I personally like that he just says whatever pops into his head. There is no filter there, and I love it. Oh my goodness, I love it. We've all had that moment where we wish we could say the snarky thing, and you don't. But Sherlock never pauses.
Oh yeah. When it comes to the Metropolitan Police, he refers to Lestrade as the best of a bad lot.
Yeah.
Just high praise from Holmes.
Absolutely. But even then, we're just talking about, this character, and a smile has not dropped from my face the whole time. You can't help but smile and think about, just how zany and crazy and intelligent, but, kind and, lawful he is.
He always sought justice, and he was perfectly willing to break the law to get there.
Yeah.
And there were times when he let criminals go because he didn't think they deserved to be arrested. Because he cared about true justice rather than what happens to be on the law books.
Oh, absolutely.
And like I said, like Doyle, Holmes was a champion of the underdog. He was always there for people. Some person describing the stories referred to them as that golden age where it's always 1895 and Sherlock Holmes is in his apartment at 221B Baker Street. It harkens back to a simpler time, a time that's in one way very far removed from us, but the Victorian age is so close to the modern era, we can still imagine what it looks like. It's not like it's set in the Middle Ages or something where we can't automatically picture things. And partly because of Sherlock Holmes, we all know what a hansom cab looks like. We all know, that kind of thing. And so he embodies an era and a time. To some, because that was a time when England dominated the earth. Yeah. He represents that kind of British imperialism, which I think Holmes himself would disagree with if he were here. Yeah. He certainly didn't see himself that way at all.
No, he was the local superhero. You knew where he lived. He took clients in his home. You know, if you had a problem and the police have failed you, at all the usual avenues have failed you, there is local superhero Sherlock Holmes to go and see, and he'll fix your problem like that.
Yeah, he wasn't the first consulting detective, but he by far the most famous.
Oh, absolutely.
And almost everyone that came after him was either a recreation of his best traits or a backlash to his traits or something like that. Because you can't create a detective without Sherlock Holmes being a part of him. You just can't. That's how pervasive his myth is.
Yeah, he's like he's a folk hero.
He's
a folk hero. He's a great big folk hero.
Any conclusions?
In conclusions, I'm going to find a good quote.
Yes.
Good quote. We've got crime is common, logic is rare, which I love. It's just so good. Something he says to Watson, you have a grand gift for silence, Watson. It makes you quite invaluable as a companion.
One of my favorite quotes is when they're going out into the countryside, he tells Watson, there is more horror in a quiet country lane than the meanest street in London.
True. My name is Sherlock Holmes. It is my business to know what other people do not know. I abhor the dull routine of existence. I crave for mental exhalation. That is why I have chosen my own particular profession, or rather created it, for I am the only one in the world.
Yes.
I think that's a good one to close out on.
Absolutely. So Conan Doyle and his creation Sherlock Holmes, and next time we'll see all the different permeations and mutations that Holmes has gone through over the years to become one of the world's most popular characters. All right, so until then, I have been Ed.
I've been Michaela.
We'll see you next time. Until then, be safe.
Be happy, be healthy.
Bye.
Bye.